Hi, I'm Julie Maven and I lived in Garth essentially from 1969 to 1986, apart from 1 year when they were modernising, and I lived in Garth in 1979. I've actually written a book, a 182-page book called Jam, Butty and Bottle of Tea Bairns, basically a recollection of loads of memories of different people my age and a little bit younger, have grown up in the Garths in the 70s and early 80s. We reminisce about things like games we used to play, people that lived in the Garths, old characters such as Old Emily and the Mulvaneys, if I'm allowed to say the name on camera, but there you are. And just things like when kids say they're bored nowadays, and I think, how can you ever be bored? We were never bored. There wasn't one of us fat, well there was one, I'm not mentioning any names, but the rest of us were all really skinny because we were running around all day tormenting old folk and playing games and running around the Garths. We never had time to be bored, and that was essentially why I wrote the book in the first place, because I was sick of hearing kids say we're bored, and I thought, as bands, we never got bored. A few of the lads whose dads worked in the shipyards, as mine did, worked on the fish quay. So whenever we wanted anything like rope, because we made swings, our own swings, or just things to play with, like old bits of tin. You wouldn't believe what we did with old bits of tin. Our dads would bring them, and there was lads like Ian Swinnow, whose dad had a fishing boat, and the Moles, and they would get the big thick rope from the fish quay, tie it on the top of the archway in Garth, from the second veranda down, a stick on the bottom for a seat, and then we would tie a rope to the end of it for everybody to pull like a big tug of war. Sit somebody on that stick, I don't know, we didn't kill ourselves, pull them right up and then leave go, and your backside used to touch the top of the arch. That is not an exaggeration. Anybody that's been on that swing would tell you it's worse than the death swing or the double death swing at Derwent Hill. And we played on that for hours and hours until some cantankerous old biddy on the second veranda would cut it down because of the noise. Usually our backsides banging off the floor and they couldn't hear the telly. So they would cut that down, we'd just put it up again somewhere else, or tie it round a lamppost and be swinging round lampposts all day, or off the bottom veranda. Then, once we were bored with that, or we'd had enough of it, we used to climb over the little roof, we called it, which had a shelf underneath from the first veranda, climb off that and drop, see who could drop. None of us had any broken limbs from dropping off the wall, I've got to admit, and we used to love it. We used to hide under it, and I have a real fear of spiders, and now when I come to think of it, there must have been hundreds under there, under that little lip. But we did always play on there, and we had the muck hole. The muck hole was my favourite place in the Garth. It was just myself and my best friend at the time, Colleen Taylor. We used to sit there for hours, running in the house for water, and we used to nick spoons or forks or knives, anything we could, lolly sticks, if we couldn't get cutlery, to mix the water to make mud pies. And then if we couldn't get water, if our mums kicked us out, one of us, you know, usually would need a wee by about 11 o'clock, so we'd just go a wee in the mud and mix that in. And the poor kids that we used to feed the mud pies to, well, we didn't tell them the whole ingredients of the pies. On the morning when I come out at number 18, there was a drain pipe right there. I'd take my knickers off, tuck them behind, 3-year-old, you know, play about, wee until my heart's content, get called in, slip the knickers on in the house. And Colleen Taylor's mum told me dad what I was doing. He said, hey Ronnie, she hasn't weighed herself for days, man. She just went out, she puts her knickers behind there. She's still weighing, she just isn't wearing the knickers. Another game that we used to play quite a bit was catchy help, or catchy on high, or it was just like chasing everybody around. It was, I would say a catchy kiss, but none of us ever really wanted to kiss anybody. So we just used to play catchy help. And that just consisted of everybody, all the kids, fleeing everywhere. Somebody was man, poor person who was man, because it wasn't limited to just in the middle of the Garth. You could run anywhere. So we were up on the verandas and the little roof, everywhere. This kid who was man had no chance of catching anybody really, unless he was like Usain Bolt, and none of us were. We were fast, but not that fast. So we used to play that for hours on end. British Bulldog, we used to, or Lamperoy we used to call it, played that in the middle of the Garths. All the team games that, like, people on the estates, I wouldn't think would have the room to play them in roads and streets, where we had this big open space in the middle of the Garth where we could run round all hours. So we used to play Lamperoy, Catchy on High, Catchy Help. Then there was knocking 9 doors, where you would just knock on anyone's door and run away. But I used to get wrong for that. I'd get grounded. Kick the biscuit tin. Queenie Who's Got the Ball. Put a ball in a pair of your mum's tights. But for goodness sake, God forbid you took quite a new pair that you'd only had on about 6 times, because you would get into big trouble. So we used to play Queenie Who's Got the Ball, which consisted of whoever was man throwing the ball and then somebody picking it up and hiding it. We all used to sing, Queenie, Queenie, who's got the ball? I haven't got it. It isn't in my pocket. Queenie, Queenie, who's got the ball? And you knew whoever kept a hand behind the back had it really. It wasn't rocket science. But sometimes you used to tuck it down the waistband of the trousers so you couldn't find it, unless you went in. Even in the winter, we would never be in the house. Sometimes our mums would shout us in to get changed, or particularly if it was snowing or raining. But essentially we were out from morning till night, going back in for meals if we wanted them. Sometimes we'd just have a sandwich or a packet of crisps, just run out and still play out. And in the summer months, when it was, you know, the light nights, we'd be out on a morning. Quite often, a few of the mums and their families, because the dads were always at work, would walk over the bridge and down to Roker Beach, sit there, have a picnic, come back and then sit out. And the likes of Pat Jones and my mum and Margie Greener, quite a few of the women, Violet Little, sorry, my mum always called her Violet Clayton, all used to sit out with the kids, and we'd sit for hours until it must have been about 10 o'clock at night, and then we'd all be back in, and the next day the same, never in. I can never ever remember going shopping with my mum, or, you know, to the town for shopping. We always were just, oh, will you look after them while I just nip up to Lipton's or wherever. And we just stayed and played. We never were hanging around our mother's skirts when we were kids. In the snow, we would be in the house more, simply because we had to change our socks, the ones on our hands, not the feet, because we didn't have the beauty of gloves. We just used to wear socks on our hands and get some bags or a lid off somebody's bin, or some people had sledges if the dad knocked one up at the shipyards, and we'd be out on the Fish Quay bank all day in the snow, coming in to change your socks, and that was it. You never in. Fantastic camaraderie were all the kids. A few of the characters that used to habitually be around the Garths, some of them weren't even from the Garths when you think about Atamata, and we used to get her walking along High Street if she was coming from the East End Club to the Clarendon or the Boar's Head, whichever route she was taking on a pub crawl that night. And we used to take a bag off her. I mean, it's a bit cruel when you think of it now, but that was fun to us, it was all game. We used to take a bag off her and then sing to her, Shirley Atamata, eating chips and butter. Who killed Alan? Shirley Atamata, with her chips and butter. Oh, we used to torture her. So she was, game for our things. She used to chase us. Alan used to chase us. You'll get the boot, you'll get it. But we weren't even scared of him. Poor lad. Then in the Garths, the characters in the Garths, in Weir Garth, there was one particular old woman. I can never remember her surname, but she was called Old Emily, and she lived on the top veranda near the moles. And she was always round Doreen Swalwell's house, my friend Karen Weatherly's mum. And one day, Old Emily was sitting, and she used to swear, but she used to say shacking instead of the F word. So shacking this, shacking that, everything was shacking. And this one day she said, "Hey Doreen, where's that shacking budgie gone?" Because Sparky, Karen's beloved budgie, had stopped squawking. Anyway, Old Emily got up to return to her flat, and poor Sparky was sparked out, suffocated. She'd sat on him. That wasn't very good. We had to bury him in the muck hole. beginning around about the early 80s, a lot of families started moving up to the estates. I think they wanted gardens, or they wanted a bigger house with an upstairs, and you know, quite a few families kind of moved out of the area. The Greeners, the Richardsons, there was quite a few. Ourselves, we moved. And then obviously in the early 90s there was the regeneration programme for the Garths, in which they were pulling them down and rebuilding. But a lot of the families from the Garths I found still stayed in the area, were moved, decanted from the Garths into the newer houses, and a lot of my oldest friends are still down here. So even though I moved in 86, a lot of my friends still lived in the Garths, so I was quite often down here visiting Sharon Prest, the Prests, Julie Jones, quite a few who I would still keep contact with. And to this day, these people are still living around here. And although I didn't live here, I had very strong connections to the East End and kept involved with places like Chance, which is where I now work, as a board member and as a user of the centre. I always kept one foot in this camp and another in Southwick, where I lived as a teenager, and then ultimately moved all over. I moved back down to the East End myself with my partner at the time, and then we bought a house in South Shields, so we didn't live here for very long, but we were in the area. And it was quite nice to see that a lot of the old families, I mean, on one part of the Vines, in a row of about 3 or 4 houses, you've still got all the little sisters who we grew up with. They're still all there, and I just think it's a place where memories are made but lives are forged, and people still live here. There isn't a lot in the area, but it's a place that's full of spirit and still has that community feeling about it when you come down, which is great. Our first flat in the Garths was number 18, which was on the ground floor looking up to the Weymouth Bridge, and it was lovely. It only had 2 bedrooms, one that was the shape of a coffin that you could just get bunk beds in. That was my room, but the rest were nice, and the other bedroom was my mum and dad's. I can't really quite remember that, but I remember we had the big open fire, the coal range, and my mum used to cook on that. We only had a little baby Bellin cooker at the time. She used to cook on that, and we had a big pantry, and we didn't have a fridge. I remember that we didn't have a fridge initially because the pantry was really cold, so you could keep things for a couple of days. And then this range in the living room was fantastic. My mum used to cook all bread in the oven on the side of it, and put stews in, panately and things like that in the oven on the fire. And I just thought that was quite normal life. Your mum sitting cooking your tea on the fire, that was just normal. And I thought a lot of the flats in the Garths were beautiful. Some people had them beautiful, you know, they'd be out painting their windowsills and everything. And these were the older people, a lot of the older people who'd moved in when they were built. Had Mrs. Hughes on the bottom, had lived there since before the war. And you just think when they were built, the likes of these people had moved from slums around Silver Street area and other slums in the East End into these fantastic state-of-the-art modern buildings that had a bath, that had running water, that had electricity and hot and cold running water, because you had your back boiler behind this amazing fire range. And I'm assuming they would have all done the cooking on the fire in the day, because they wouldn't have had fridges and things. But it was just such a fantastic place to live, because everybody knew everybody for a start. Everybody felt safe with everybody, and there was a gang called the Garth lads back in the earliest days. I'm sure some of the older residents would remember them, who used to keep people away. They used to keep people from coming in and doing awful things in the Garths. They used to protect the Garths, these lads. I've only heard tale of them, but I'm sure old people remember them. But these people, they're the ones that forged that community, and their families after them lived in there because it was the place to live. That, like you think of Mrs. Hughes's family, they all lived there and then moved on to the estates later on. Viley Clayton's mum lived there, old Mrs. Clayton. Then Viley lived in her house because that was a big 3-bedroom flat. You know, they to me were huge at the time, and they had a big family. I think I'm not sure how many family the Littles had, but there's quite a few of them, and they all lived with a nana, and it was just an amazing sense of community that you lived overlooking these people, you were right next door, and you always knew there was somebody looking out for you. You never had any burglaries and things like that until later in the day, before the regen, when people from other estates, because they had empty flats and that they needed filling because they kind of have no rents coming in, they were just moving people in from anywhere really. And a lot of them were what they were called back in the day like gyro drops, people just wanting a flat anywhere to get their benefits. And I think that was partly the downfall of an amazing community, an amazing space to live. As kids in the Garths, we were quite entrepreneurial in our skills, I've got to admit. We had little jobs. On a Sunday morning, for instance, we would get up and I'd knock on for Colleen about 8:30 and have me breakfast at their house. Ronnie always used to just give us me breakfast. Then we would go and sit on the wall and knock on people's doors. It was Mrs. Dagg, Mrs. Hepton, Mrs. Redmond, Mrs. Curtis and Mrs. Ellis, round Fan Ellis, and Mrs. Conlon. We used to get all the Sunday papers for them, and they would pay us in Yorkshire puddings usually, or sauce on bread, because that was our favourite thing. So we would have a Yorkshire pudding from Mrs. Curtis, one from Sarah Redmond, one from Sarah Hepton, and Mrs. Conlon just used to give us a shilling. And then about dinner time, Mrs. Lamb, Colleen's nana, used to shout for us because she used to bake bread every Sunday, and the smell was just a smell I'll never forget. It's not a smell you smell anywhere else. Mrs. Lamb's bread was fantastic. And then we used to get that in a tea towel, the flat cakes, all lovely and hot, and walk round the new houses, they're not new houses now, but they were then, and deliver them to Mrs. Strange and this other lady who I didn't know. But for our troubles, we used to get a bread bun with proper butter on that you bought in a quarter at Conroy's shops. Then we had our paper round. Well, I had a paper round, and if Tommy Conroy is watching this, that was slave labour, I'm sorry. 80 pence a week, and I used to spend that on batteries for my torch because the lights were always off in the Garths. I used to do the Garths, the new houses, and the 3 flats for 80 pence a week. Thinking about defining what an EastEnder is for me, and particularly as a kid, I would have said anybody that lived nowhere further than the church, than the Holy Trinity Church, or at the top of the church walk, or Church Street East, past the East End Club. To me, if you lived past that, you weren't an EastEnder. And I remember somebody over in the court had said that they were an EastEnder, and they weren't. I was like, no, that's Hendon. Hendon Court, it's called. And they were saying, no, but we consider ourselves an EastEnder. Well, you might well do, but Hendon Court surely is in Hendon. But that was just me thinking that. But my own opinion of an EastEnder is somebody born from the Welcome or the Docks up to about the East End Club. I would have said Church Street East, maybe a little bit further, maybe the shop. But that to me, if you want to be a proper EastEnder, that's where you're from. And I think about the Garths. I mean, even people coming over from Hendon were a bit reticent walking down the East End, coming down the church walk. They would say, "Oh, we're not EastEnders." If they were from over in the thick of Hendon, Railway Court, they would come down and say, "Oh, we always felt a bit fearful coming down," but not that there was any aggro or anything like that. But they probably weren't made to feel very welcome. Keep your own dickies over your own end. That's what I used to say. Between the Garths, particularly Burley Garth and Weir Garth, which is what I would remember, there was quite a bit of rivalry and, inter-Garth competition, let's say. The lads would play football on the moor, Weir Garth versus Burley Garth. And you had, obviously, the Burley Garth lads with the likes of Jeff Moon, Ray Blake, Mickey Waters, Derek Waters, all of those. And the lads from Weir Garth were the bigger lads, the Morleys and Swinnows, and that, those families all used to play football. The mams the mums, the rivalry even stretched to the mums, because they used to all play football. I'm not sure if it was for charity or if it was just a fun thing for them to do, but the mums used to have a kick about on a Saturday morning sometimes on the moor in proper football strips and everything. And then you had bonfire night. Now it was real rivalry. I mean, it was cutthroat, the bonfires, because usually there was only a couple of telegraph poles in the area, and it was whoever cut the first one down. And Burleygarth, I've got to admit it, although I hate to admit it, always had the bigger bonfire. I don't know if they had more lads or bigger lads, but they always had the bigger bonfire. Ours was always in the garth behind the workman's hut, but from what I can remember, theirs was always on the moor. So I would just like to point out that I only think it was because they had more space and they weren't going to set fire to the place. That's all the reason they had the bigger bonfire. Then, as we were kids, our mums would send us to Cliffy's on a Sunday tea time for a quarter boiled bacon between the five of us. And then, obviously, Cliffy's was the other side of Burleygarth, so we would have to walk through Burleygarth to get to Cliffy's, if you understand what I mean. But quite often we would rather go around the outside as get pelted, walking through. But at school there was never any rivalry between any of the Garths. In St John's School we all got on great, we were best of mates. But come out of school and go into your own respective Garths, and therein this solidarity ended. You were Weirgarth and Burleygarth. I think some of the happiest times in the Garths were when everyone pulled together. If there was an event like the FA Cup final in 1973, when a lot of the dads travelled down to Wembley to watch it, but all the mums, Margie Greeners, Violet Little and all them, my mum, they all got together and went round and collected money from people. I'm not sure how much, but they charged people, families, to like per head for a picnic meal and that in the Garth, and we had this massive party. And I can remember wearing the red and white plastic hats, I still love them hats, and singing songs like Nice One Cyril. I didn't even know who Cyril is at the time, but Nice One Cyril, let's have another one. I don't know if he scored the goal, who scored the goal. I didn't even know very much about football, but I do remember that this great party with a fantastic atmosphere. And I was only 5 at the time, so that's probably why my recollection of that is a little bit vague. But then the next big thing was 1977, the Queen's Silver Jubilee. That was another amazing party. If anything, as the years went on, the parties got better. And I don't know if it was because we were getting older, so it would take more of a part. But I had my Union Jack socks. I used to wear them all the time. I think I even still wore them in 1978. I'm really a royalist at heart. I would say that I was a Spice Girl born too soon. That's what I think. So we had this massive party for the Queen's Silver Jubilee. But then in 1981, when it was the royal wedding of Charles and Diana, there was an even bigger party. Although they didn't have all the big tables set out, and you know, that it was just a couple of tables and a few of us in one corner of the Garth because of how they modernised the internal structure of the Garths. It was still an amazing day. We danced. I remember dancing. I was trying to teach Colleen Taylor some of my killer moves, and she actually won the competition with my killer moves. And I just remember dancing until it was dark, and that was, I think it was in June, so it must have been quite late. But we were all up, and these parties were like the cement that built the Garths, people just putting a few coppers together. Yes, we'll put a couple of pound or however much it was, and set up these fantastic days that are lasting memories. Something you like never ever forget. I think some of my fondest memories of the Garths, the dark ages, let's call them the word, were the power cuts in the 70s when there were all these strikes and things going on, and there was massive power cuts, and we would be sitting for hours on end with no light but candles or the light of the fire in the grate, and it was just amazing. I used to love that, and the only noise you would hear, obviously because none of our tellies were on, were like chatting, so you could sit. And I've always been a geek. I've loved to get inside of people's heads and ask them questions, which is probably why they probably tried to get us adopted on numerous occasions. But I used to love to just sit and talk and ask questions. So I would sit in my Nana Hughes's house, who wasn't really my Nana, and chat to her about the olden days and about her growing up. And because it happened that she'd been Queen Elizabeth at the coronation party in the Garths, which was quite good. She'd played Queen Elizabeth. And you just think, like, these power cuts to me were I was always like a sponge. So during the power cuts was when I sucked in most of the information and most of the things that I still remember, and I loved them. Just thinking back to the times of all these industrial action and power cuts, I think I remember coal was quite expensive. I remember Mars coming round and people like that, the coal men, and coal was really expensive, so some people could only get half a bag off them, and they did used to sell them half a bag, I remember. But then just over the Rayleigh, over the moor, all the coal trains used to pull up there. They were shunted into there, and some of the lads, quite resourceful lads, you know, you're talking about Bunter and Danny Cowans and Kenny Anderson, all them, decided why all this coal, the resource that we could use, is sitting in these trains overnight. Let's get it. So they used to go over the wall, they would call it, and just steal all the coal and sell it for like £1 a bag or something. And quite often they would be chased by the railway police through the Garths with big sacks of coal on the back. But there was always somebody would open the front door and let them in, just to hide out the way. Quite often they would have to drop a bag of coal just so that they would get away if there was a particularly fast policeman after them. But mostly they were really, really looked after, because these lads were getting stuff that was a real valuable commodity. They were getting coal that we needed to burn. Because I've seen times when the coal was quite expensive that people have been burning bits of old furniture, shoes, everything, like we did when you know, times were hard. Sometimes there'd been layoffs at the shipyards and they would burn anything that was flammable they would burn. And I think now I'm not a religious person, and I think growing up we would never consider ourselves religious people because I didn't know what religion was, to be fair. We went to Church of England school, pretty much most of the Garths, unless they were Catholic and they went to St Patrick's school in St Pat's Garth. But the majority of us were Church of England, and we went to St John's Church of England school. We Garth had the High Street Mission for our Sunday school, which we went to religiously every Sunday. Before our Sunday dinner, we'd fight over who was ringing the bell, get 2p off our mum or dad to put in the collection, and we were in there singing our tops off to all the great songs. The one over the other side, next to Burley Garth, was Prospect Row Mission, I've remembered now, and that was predominantly people from Burley Garth went there for their Sunday school. They sang better songs like I Met Jesus at the Crossroads and all that. I was always quite jealous of that one. Didn't know what it meant, because they didn't have crossroads in those days probably. But never mind. I had my Sunday school, they had their Sunday school, and although we wouldn't profess to be religious, we clearly were. We used to love going and listening to the stories of the Good Samaritan and people like that. Then on a Sunday tea time at 6:30 was the service in the Holy Trinity Church. And quite a few of us used to get in, have our tea, and then nip over there, because you got sandwiches and biscuits and a cup of tea afterwards as well. So you listened and smelt all the lovely smells of the incense and listened to the people singing, and some of the women were lovely singers. My friend Diane's Nana, she used to go, she was about 5'11", so you could hear her above everybody else. And it was just such a lovely feeling, like you wouldn't consider it a spiritual thing, because we always thought we only went for the tea and biscuits, you see. But I think we must have got some kind of spiritual uplifting from it, because you always came out feeling a bit better that you'd went, even though you weren't forced to go. Back in the day, like our mums and their mums would have been made to go to church. We just went because we wanted to mix in, and you know, a lot of the time we would laugh at some of the people singing, but ultimately we were quite reverent. We used to sit and listen to Father Michael or whoever else was giving the sermons, and we did listen, and I think we did really well considering we were all rebels.